This is the landing approach at Greifenberg in Austria. The landing field's at about 1500 feet. You can see that my landing approach is very poor. I should have been a lot higher. If I'd have been higher, I would have been able to dive at the ground and get into ground effect and then level out. As it was, because I was so low and only just crossed the road, I couldn't pull in enough speed to have a decent flare. When I did flare, I didn't have enough energy to push the glider upwards, and I was still travelling sideways, so I just basically didn't flare hard enough. This is a landing approach at the Long Mind. The landing field is 1500 feet above sea level. There is about a 15 mile an hour wind coming from the west, so from the right to the left. You cannot cross over the road as there is a glider field in that direction, so we did a crosswind landing approach. There is rotor at the back of the field as well, so I was trying to come in not too far back, not too far forward, so I didn't overshoot. Pulling on a reasonable amount of speed. As you can see, I came down into ground effect, but I didn't hold my speed and unfortunately made a slight flare, then didn't hold it. I should have done a more stronger flare, held it out, and then I would have been okay. This is the same approach, but this time I held the speed and made a much nicer round out and flare. In these pictures I tried to show what happens when you stall a hang glider and when you land. The angle of attack at the root has stalled, so there's no lift there, but the tips are still flying, giving lift behind the centre of mass of the pilot. The centre of mass is pulling in front of the tips, so it just naturally gives a nose down moment, so that'll just slam the nose into the ground. At this point, the root has stalled, but the tips are now stalled as well. So that kills the lift at the tips, preventing the nose down effect, and what happens is the pilot then moves forwards because of the braking action of the glider, and it's easy to get your leg. This is the landing approach that those stills were taken from. As you can see, as I flare, I hold the flare. If I'd have released the flare too early, I would have nosed in, but because I held the flare, you get a good stall of the glider, feet move forwards, and good landing. This is a landing approach at an aerotow field. As you can see, I have good speed on approach, but get it wrong as I'm doing my final flare. I don't push out hard enough and don't give a good enough flare, probably with not enough speed on approach. This is a landing approach to the same field. On this occasion we had put the spot out to simulate a short field landing to practice landing in a shorter landing field. The square landing approach is reasonable. As I pull onto the finals, pull on good speed, and then line up on the spot, keeping your head high and looking to the end of the field. Now moving on to the uprights. Now pulling quite a lot of speed on, still aiming for the landing approach, and then round out and flare just beyond the spot, but only about 30 yards. This is another top landing. It's in a 15 mile an hour wind, so pulling on a considerable amount of speed to cut through the lift, then coming into land, holding the speed, but then a reasonable round out, and then very gentle flare because of the wind. On this landing approach, We had to land within 100 meters of the road and where the cars are parked, but there was a farmer shearing his sheep on the left, so I didn't want to come in too low because of scaring the sheep and also annoying the farmer. As it was, I came in too high and missed the first 100 feet. You can see I try and get down, but flare at the last minute, but couldn't hold the flare as I could see the ground dropping away. Then I start to go down the sloping area of the field, and I just have to hold the glider just cruising down the downslope until I reach the flat area at the bottom. As it was at the flat area at the bottom, I should have given a massive flare, but completely got it wrong, didn't give a decent flare, and nosed in. Another top landing approach, this time in 12-mile-an-hour wind. Made a good fast approach, held the speed on, but as I got near to the ground, I made sure I was plenty low enough and then rounded out and flared at the last minute because I was getting near to the front of the hill. On this landing approach, I am higher than my previous one at Greifenberg in Austria. My crosswind approach at this point is reasonably high. Still could have been a little bit higher, I feel, but then as I come on my finals at this point, I'm now heading straight into wind, hands moving up, crossing the road and then flare, but I could have had my hands higher and definitely could have flared vertically, not horizontally. On this approach, I did a reasonable approach. This is the into wind, then I'm just going to into the crosswind approach. So now into the crosswind leg. You can see the landing field, the square one on the right. So this is crosswind. And then as I turn into wind, I should have pulled on a little bit more speed. Didn't have quite enough speed. Hands are reasonably high. That flare just isn't aggressive enough, so I couldn't run fast enough to hold the glider up. This is the same landing field. The wind has changed 90 degrees now, so this is the crosswind approach. Landing field on the left, and now I'm turning on into wind. Hands on uprights, pulling on a decent amount of speed this time. You could see the glider nose down and dive at the ground. Holding the speed, hands high on uprights. This time I gave a better flare and stopped the glider. This is landing at the aerotow field again. Pulling on a good amount of speed, round out and a good hard flare this time, much better. On this graph, I compare a slow landing approach to a fast landing approach. At the point of flare, a hang glider requires enough energy to lift the glider or at least maintain altitude as the pilot's mass reacts against the glider to stall the complete wing. If there is insufficient energy, the glider center or root will stall, leaving the tips flying and pushing upwards. This will cause the nose to come down and either nose in or land on your knees. The blue line shows a slow landing approach that's only just above min-sync. The glider comes in at min-sync, slowly losing altitude and coming down to the ground. Only once the glider gets to the ground does the pilot think about flaring. Then he's got insufficient energy to flare the glider while still maintaining his altitude, resulting in a nose-in or a splat. On this landing approach, this is the fast landing approach, the pilot dives at the ground, rounds out into ground effect, and then slowly slows the glider down whilst he's in ground effect. At the point where he's ready to flare, he's still got enough energy to flare the glider and maintain altitude as he flares the complete glider, bringing his feet forward, stalling the complete glider, and then stopping the glider and landing. On this slide, I try to indicate some of the issues with the top landing approach. You need to look at the shape of a top landing field. On this field, you can see that the land drops away when it gets to the road. In strong winds, this can cause a very strong wind gradient, which can be only 30 feet high. So at 30 feet, you've got strong wind. Down at ground level, you can actually get curl over or zero wind, causing nose-ins or bad landings. What you need to do is approach from a higher angle, miss the rear of the field, and try and land on the crown of the top landing area. Although there were some hard landings in this video, the worst I got were grass stains on my knees with no damage to the glider. The whole point of making this video was to coach and help other pilots. I had to look through all of my videos to find enough bad landings, and I hasten to add, I very rarely do make a bad landing, and you've seen all of my bad landings in the last 3 or 4 years. I do hope this helps, and please add comments if you feel like you'd like to reply to any of my comments.